and moving into the Department of Commerce, which, as Tim pointed out, has a smaller overall budget than the Army's IT budget, really setting the stage there. But there are some things here that jump out at me, and the first is that while that $2.51 billion is a, it's relatively modest IT budget, even in the non-defense government, it represents over a quarter of Commerce's entire discretionary spending. And that is the highest proportion of IT dollars to anything else in the entire non-defense government. A lot of that spending comes down to what's going on at NOAA, particularly designing and operating their new networks of weather satellites. Now, the second thing that really jumps out at me here is the proportion of DME to steady state at the department, which is more heavily weighted towards DME than anywhere else in the civilian government. Now, again, a lot of that comes down to what NOAA is doing, but there are also major developmental activities at both the Patent and Trademark Office, or PTO, and the Bureau of the Census, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later. Now, I also want to point out what I call the big three of commerce bureaus, and that's NOAA, Census, and USPTO. Those three combined account for 88% of the department's total IT budget. So they're really where you're going to want to look for sales opportunities at Commerce.
Here you'll see the structure of the department, and Commerce has historically been a very federated department, and that's really not surprising when you consider the extremely disparate mission areas that the bureaus have. And that's also sort of reflected in the management of their IT dollars as well, with bureau CIOs having a lot of authority and a lot of the budget that they actually can spend, they spend independent of headquarters guidance. Now, that's changing a little bit, but for the time being, keep in mind that almost all of the sales opportunities at Commerce are going to be at the bureau level. And as for the bureaus to focus here, Chris highlighted those on the last slide: NOAA, Census, USPTO. They're really the priority areas here. They've got the money. They also have very broad mission areas. And that creates opportunity for everything from big data technologies to security, commodity infrastructure for storage, particularly at NOAA, and the Census is going to probably look to build some of those systems out as well. And you'll also find a home for business applications development in almost every single one of these bureaus.
Now, the Office of the CIO, which is headed by Simone Zickman here, is a pretty small group, as you can see. Like the other agencies that we've talked about, this office historically was really just a policy shop. But it is starting to assume a little bit more of that central IT management of enterprise-wide technology, as well as offering some basic infrastructure and other services to some of the smaller commerce bureaus. So one group to look out for here is the Information Technology Services Office, which really handles those IT infrastructure services both at headquarters and at the smaller bureaus. And I also want to point out the Cybersecurity Office, both because they set the overall cyber policy here, and so their guidance determines what security capabilities are required and which aren't, and because Commerce is looking at standing up an enterprise SOC in FY14. And we've talked about that increasing consolidation of IT management and budget authority at the department level. This is really DOC's manifestation of that. So look for some solicitations to start coming out of that group as the consolidation plans continue to take effect. And before we finish up with the organizational information here, I do want to take a look at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And incidentally, I'm not going to discuss Census or PTO's organizations today, but again, you will find that in your territory planners. NOAA is a large enough group, geographically even, that it sort of makes sense to think of them as another department. So what you're going to see here, again, are those corporate functions, which are headquarters at the top, and the line offices, which execute the mission. At the line office level, the real priority areas are the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service, or NESDIS, and the National Weather Service, or NWS. Both of those handle the bulk of the budget here for the agency. The Chief Information Officer at NOAA, Joe Klimovitz, reports up to the Deputy Undersecretary for Operations. In terms of programs, the highest profile area that you're going to be looking for here is the GOZAR series of weather satellites, which is currently in development and should hopefully be fully operational by 2016. And that system brings a ton of development funding with it, particularly around its ground systems, which really run the gamut of big data requirements.
So moving on to contractors and vehicles, the obvious takeaway here is that Harris dominates contract work at the department, with a lot of that spending coming from NOAA, where they're actually heavily involved in developing the satellite networks and the infrastructure. They also have a footprint at actually the other two big bureaus as well. Now, in terms of vehicles, you'll notice there's a pretty nice mix of GSA contracts, both schedules and GWACs, and agency or bureau-specific contracts. The two really worth calling out here are the NOAA Link contract and SDIT-NG. And that's actually the contract that handles a lot of the application and system development activities for USPTO.
Really, the major thing that's driving IT procurement across Commerce, it's pretty simple. They're spending too much money on their IT infrastructure, and that's taking away from their ability to really focus in on their missions, which is unique in the civilian space. So look for the department to continue centralizing IT management under Simone Zygmunt's group, even if it takes longer than usual in such a historically federated environment. Now, I also mentioned earlier that the department is looking to stand up an enterprise SOC, which is another part of those consolidation efforts that I mentioned, but also comes with, obviously, some massive security requirements. And the breadth of what the department is doing here leads to an equally disparate set of those requirements. So PTO and Census both have healthy data protection needs since they handle large amounts of PII and intellectual property data. But NOAA also has a wealth of security requirements that really aren't talked about as much. That is particularly true at NWS, whose weather data is critical to a number of other systems, including NextGen over at FAA. So there's some worry here that an attack on NOAA's weather data systems could result in either economic or even physical damage. And as a result, there are some pretty high-profile security requirements around NOAA's systems that represent some areas of opportunity here.
Moving into some Commerce programs, we'll discuss Patents End-to-End 2, or PE2E2. So this is a follow-on to PE2E SE, and that's been a big part of USPTO's development of its patent management system. This includes both the application or applying for a patent as well as storing the information there. Now, while this is technically a new investment for FY14, which in a normal year under a CR wouldn't be able to go anywhere, we don't expect that to be the case here because it is really following on to PE2E SE. So we think there's a pretty good chance that you're going to see this program move forward. And there are big application development requirements here. You can see some of the primes listed on the contract. These are actually the folks that are on SDIT-NG as well. Specific development requirements that have been called out so far for the coming fiscal year really center around enterprise search, knowledge discovery, and data quality tools with this program.
And the final Commerce program we're going to look at today is the Census IT infrastructure investment. Now, we usually don't like presenting on infrastructure investments since their requirements do tend to be pretty cut and dry, but that's not really the case here. Now, Census is making a big push to build a mobile infrastructure in preparation for the 2020 census. And the funding for that development is going to come out of this FY14 DME bucket, which you can see took a jump of around $30 million. Now, there are also some virtualization requirements here, which suggests that cloud activity at Census is being funded from this bucket. And to that end, the Bureau is looking at designing a private cloud to move some of their infrastructure and business applications onto. And so, again, cloud implementation and management tools are going to be a requirement at Census this year. Other developmental activities are really focused on developing an enterprise testing platform, as well as implementing a new backup system in anticipation of moving some of that critical data onto the private cloud.